Good day everybody. Today we will discuss about our new topic that who is a piping engineer, their roles and responsibilities, whether piping engineering as a career is lucrative enough, what are the rough or average salaries of entry level piping engineers, who can be a piping engineer, piping engineering courses, etc. The main points that I will cover in this video presentation are introduction, then types of piping engineer, how many types of piping engineer we know, then roles and responsibilities of each type of piping engineers, then piping engineer as a career option, whether one should opt for piping engineering as their career or not, skills required for becoming a piping engineer, entry level salaries of piping engineers in different countries, piping engineering courses, and finally piping engineering jobs, means name of some of the companies which provides jobs to piping engineers. Now what we mean as piping engineers? Piping engineers deal with the piping network of any plant. There are plants in oil and gas sector, petrochemical, refinery, chemical, power plant, steel, water, pharmaceutical sectors. In all those plants, there will be piping network. So the main responsibility or role of these piping engineers are that they design, troubleshoot, and construct all the problems or all the aspects of plant piping system. Now types of piping engineers. Now, depending on the job profile of the piping engineers, means the type of job a piping engineer perform, they are broadly grouped into two main categories. So there are two main categories in a piping engineering discipline or as piping engineers. What are those two main categories? One is called piping design engineers, means who works in design consultancies and design the piping system, and the second group is called piping field engineer or piping construction engineers, means they take input from the piping design engineers, what piping design engineers design in the design consultancies or companies, and they deliver their deliverables to construction department for constructing those at the site or field. So those jobs are performed by the piping construction engineer or piping field engineers. Now there are three subgroups in the piping design engineers group. So what are those? They are the piping layout engineer, or they are also called piping design engineer. Then piping stress engineer, who perform the piping stress analysis of the piping systems. Those are designed by the layout engineers or designers or design engineers. And third group is piping materials engineer, who selects the material and various other activities that we will know in our next slides. Now roles and responsibilities. So as we learned that there are four group of piping engineers. Three are in piping design, means piping layout engineer, stress engineer, and material engineer. And fourth one is the construction engineer or field piping engineer. So all four groups of engineers, what type of roles or responsibilities they perform, we will now learn. Now piping design engineers, this piping design is a very critical activity. It requires knowledge of various aspects. Failure to a single part can cause serious damage to the plant as well as mankind. So piping layout engineers and designers should follow their duty with utmost care. A good piping layout engineer should know about the following. So what are those? First is the pipes, pipe fittings, and piping components. Means they should know various types of pipes, various types of pipe fittings. Pipe fittings means elbows, T connections, flanges, piping components means valves, if any special component is there, orifice connection. So all those type of pipes, pipe fittings, and piping components, they should know. Then code standards and specifications guidelines. So all these code standards, specification, and guidelines provide the direction to the piping design engineer to design or to help them in designing their plant. Then interaction with other engineering groups. Piping engineering group is dependent on various other groups. Also, various other groups are dependent on piping engineering. So, piping engineer should have a piping layout engineer should have the capability to interact with all engineering groups. Then piping design execution, executing the piping design activity following all the guidelines as stipulated in various codes and standards or specifications. Then software tool knowledge. In most of the piping design engineers should be knowledgeable in at least one of the 3D design softwares, like whether it may be PDMS, it may be PDS or SP3D or E3D. So at least one design software they should know. Next, working knowledge of process documents, various process documents, mainly PEFS or PNID, piping and instrumentation diagram, that they should know clearly, because that is the basis for designing or laying out the piping. Then basic process variables mean design temperature, pressure, density, material, etc. Then drawing content, they should understand the drawing properly, means what to provide in the drawing that will be deliverable for other departments, and also what to study from drawings of other departments so that the piping design activity becomes smoother. Then preliminary knowledge of process equipments. If the piping design engineers have some knowledge about the process equipments like pumps, heat exchangers, columns, then it will be advantageous for him. Basic piping routing rules means how to route a pipe, the basic rules or guidelines he should be aware of. Then allowable pipe spans for supporting and designing. Pipe spans means how at what distance a pipe will be there, or what will be the gap between two adjacent pipes, and also for supporting span will be at what interval the pipe should be supported, those type of data or knowledges. Then preliminary knowledge of pipe expansion means how a pipe expands or contracts due to the temperature change during operating condition from the installation temperature condition. If he has the preliminary knowledge of this piping expansion, then it will be easier for him to route the pipe. Then locating the piping expansion loops, he should be aware of the locations of the piping expansion loops so that later there will be very less rework. Then heat tracing, piping insulation, all he should be aware of all the piping design deliverables. So all the deliverables that will be required to make during the project, he should be well aware of. Then fabrication and construction methods, a little knowledge of the fabrication and construction methods also will help the piping design engineer to optimize their design. And finally, the plant economics. Plant economics must be known to all engineers, because by knowing that they can optimize their design so that the total cost to build the plant or to design the plant is minimized. Now we will learn about the roles and responsibility of piping stress engineer. Now, who is a piping stress engineer? Piping stress engineer is the person who ensures that the pipe routing done by the piping designers or layout engineers is consistent with the allowables in the applicable piping code. The most basic things that a good piping stress engineer should know are: first requirement is the knowledge of relevant piping codes and standards. For example, if it is a process piping, then the piping engineer should know the relevant knowledges from ASME B31.3, that is process piping code. Then piping stress analysis software. There are various softwares available in the market for piping stress analysis like Scissor2, StartProf. auto pipe, roar 2. So he should be knowledgeable in at least one of these softwares so that he can perform his analysis. Manual analysis is also possible, but that is time taking, and in nowadays it is we cannot think about doing manual piping stress analysis. So piping stress engineer should be knowledgeable in handling at least any one of the piping stress analysis software. Then knowledge of pipe fitting, flange and valves. So how these pipe items impact the stress analysis. That's a stress engineer should know. Then relationship to other engineering groups. Similar to piping design group, piping stress engineering team is also dependent of several other teams. For example, process team. Uh, Piping stress engineers should get the documents like process engineering flow scheme PEFS or PNID and line list to start their work of piping stress analysis. Also, after the analysis, they have to transfer the loads for support design of secondary structures to the civil department. So, these relationships to other engineering groups, piping stress engineers should know. Then process design variables. Design variables means, as I told earlier also, that the fluid temperature, fluid type, pressure of the fluid, density, viscosity, etc. Corrosion allowance. Then process plant equipment, equipment operation and internals. The knowledge of process plant equipments like heat exchangers, pumps, columns, fired heaters, reactors, etc. will be required to uh, create proper load cases during analysis. So basic knowledge of all these equipments and the operation of these equipments. For example, that for pump piping, if there is a three pump system, then normally two pumps will be in operating condition, one will be in standby condition. So accordingly, the piping stress engineer has to create load cases so that two pump will be always in working condition and one will be in uh, standby condition. So all these type of operating modes of equipments are required for proper piping stress analysis. Then equipment piping and nozzle loading. The preliminary guidelines for equipment piping should be known to piping stress engineer. Then nozzle loading, how or which standards mainly provides the nozzle loads of the equipments and how to qualify the nozzles based on those standard values, that should be known to piping engineers. Then allowable pipe support span. Piping supports are a very important aspects of piping engineering, and the piping engineer or piping stress engineer must know about piping supporting. Then expansion of pipe, routing of for flexibility. A piping stress engineer must be aware of routing changes to provide flexibility of the system to qualify the stresses and nozzle loads. Then weights and loads. What are the kinds of live loads? What type of dead loads, occasional loads, primary loads? All these kinds of loads he should know. Then expansion loops, expansion joints, and spring hangers. The piping stress engineer should aware about the expansion loop design, expansion joints, and requirement or application of spring hangers, so that when it is required, he should select proper piping spring hanger or expansion joint following vendor catalogs. Then all the deliverables and civil loading requirements from the piping stress department, and stretch sketch content means normally for analysis layout department is supposed to give us the a stress sketch. So the piping stress engineer should know to read that stress sketch so that he can accurately model the piping uh, in their softwares for analysis purpose. And after analysis, he should uh, inform in the same stress sketch what are the changes required in supporting or layout or routing. So all those should be properly conveyed to the layout department for so that they can incorporate all those changes. And finally the economics, because uh, by knowing the plant economics will help piping stress engineer to optimize the routing so that the total plant cost can be minimized. Let's move on to piping material engineers. Piping material engineers are piping engineering individuals who are responsible for creating the project piping classes. Project piping class is a very important document which tells us how what is the material of all piping components and the numerous piping specifications necessary to fabricate, test, insulate and paint the piping systems. Piping materials engineers activities include but not limited to the following. So what are the roles and responsibilities of a piping material engineer? First is to perform the pipe wall thickness calculation. Then to prepare the PMS or piping material specification for process and utility services. To prepare VMS or valve material specification. Now they normally do the purchasing activity of all piping items also. Uh, this includes to prepare the material requisition for getting quotations, to review the vendor offers, do technical discussions with the vendors and prepare the technical bid evaluation or TBE. They prepare the MR for purchase. Then they review the vendor documents. Uh, they prepare the list of piping specialty items like steam traps, strainers, hoses, etc. To prepare the data sheets for piping specialty items, to perform the line blank thickness calculation, to perform the reinforcement pad requirement calculation, to perform MTO or material takeoff, to control the piping items quantity, monitor the surplus and shortage of piping items, to develop fabrication, welding specification, shop and field testing specification, insulation and painting specification, to develop the technical supply conditions requirements for various piping materials and to make a technical recommendation, and finally after placement of a purchase order to review and approve documentation from vendors related to piping components. So all these are responsibilities of a piping material engineers. It more follows that when required, visit the vendor's premises to attend kickoff meetings, the testing of piping components or clarification meetings. Make sure that everyone in the piping group is aware of the materials of construction that can be used for the piping system. To liaise with the following departments like piping design and stress, process, instrumentation, vessel, mechanical, structural, procurement and material control. To maintain project technical files and update company standards. To perform the interdisciplinary or IDC checking for the part of the documents in accordance with the scope of the piping material section. So all these are the responsibilities of a piping material engineer. Let's move on to piping field engineer or field piping engineers. Field piping engineers are specialized in the field job. They erect and construct the piping system at site. Their task is to ensure all the piping that have been installed are based on the design. They will solve any problems on site and communicate to design engineering department in case there is any changes required. They will work from the installation of the piping until the commissioning. Sometimes the piping design engineers are deputed to site to perform the on-field piping engineering jobs. Now the important question, whether piping engineering as a career is good or bad. Now, as per my understanding, that piping engineering was one of the best career options earlier, but from the last few years, that we can say from the year 2014 onwards, due to a lower crude oil prices and with the advancement of electrical vehicles, the oil market suffered a huge loss. So the number of new piping projects reduced, which reduced the requirement of qualified piping engineers. At the same time, many piping engineering institutes around the world are producing a large number of piping engineers each year. So competition is increasing each day, which is directly impacting the piping engineer's salary and remuneration. Also, in recent times, there is a sudden surge of many experienced freelancers. So many companies are providing jobs to them without the need for preparing the required infrastructure to build a design team. So overall, the jobs are reducing for piping engineers, but still there are many scope for piping engineers. Means if projects are available, in those projects there are requirements, but there is a oversupply also. That is why the salaries are reducing each day. So what are the skills required for becoming a piping engineering or for becoming a piping engineer? As piping engineer is almost 95% technical job, so to become a successful piping engineer, one need to have good imagination, knowledge, and willingness to learn. The following skills are required for a good piping engineer. Those are observation skills, analytical skills, project management skills, written and verbal communication skills, and drafting skills. Normally, mechanical and chemical engineers opt for the piping design or piping engineering profession. Now, salary of a piping engineer. As there is a huge supply of piping engineers, the salary of piping engineers are comparatively less. To get a rough idea, the approximate entry level piping engineers in India usually get around rupees 40,000 per month. Entry level piping engineers in the Gulf countries usually get 1300 USD per month. However, the salary ranges in the Europe, Canada, Australia, and USA are higher. Now, piping engineering courses. To start a career in as piping engineer, usually mechanical and chemical engineers attend a piping engineer short course in some institute. The duration of the course varies from 1 month to 3 months. There are several institutes all around the globe which train students about the basics of piping engineering. In India itself, there are more than 25 institutes from where students can get preliminary piping knowledge. Currently, there is a surge of online courses of piping engineering. There are various institutes all around the world which provides online training for piping engineering. So there are two modes of knowledge that a engineer can get from piping. That one is online mode, one is offline mode. Offline mode is the physical mode where a piping engineer will go to the institute and learn about the piping engineering details, and in online mode from directly from his home at his own convenience he can learn the piping engineering details. Now, piping engineering jobs. There are various companies that offer jobs for a piping engineer. Some of these most reputed companies are Bechtel, Floor, Worley Person or Worley, Larsen and Toubro, Toyo, Petrofac, Technip, Samsung Engineering, GS Engineering, Technimont, McDermott, Udhe, Acker Solutions, Barnes and McDonnell, Toshiba, Siemens, Alstom, Punjloyd, Lisega, etc. There are many other companies which also offer job to piping engineers, but I have provided here some of the most reputed companies. So that's all for today now. Hope you like what I have shared in this video. So if you find this video useful, so kindly subscribe to the channel so that you can get the notification of my next video as soon as I publish it. That's all. Thank you.